A flight attendant tried to push a black CEO aside during boarding, but he calmly stood his. He tripped the black CEO carrying his infant, thinking a stumble could humiliate him. He didn't realize the father would stand and take control of the ground and prevented the plane from taking off, leaving the entire crew stunned. The moment Dr. Arlen Merrick's polished shoe crossed onto the aircraft floor, it happened. A sudden jolt from behind, swift, unnatural. His right foot caught something solid. Before his mind could register, gravity yanked his center of balance forward. Arlen twisted his torso instinctively, both arms locking around the small bundle on his chest. Cale, his infant son. The world blurred. Pain shot through his left shoulder as it slammed into the cold metal doorframe with a hollow clang. The force echoed through the cabin. Gasps burst from the front rows like breaking glass. Arlen grunted low, absorbing the impact entirely to protect the fragile form in his arms. Cale stirred, whimpered, but didn't wake. "Watch where you're going," came a voice behind him, low and sharp, coated in condescension. The man's tone was falsely casual, but his words sliced with intent. Arlen turned his head slightly, still crouched protectively over his child. The man now standing just behind him was in uniform, a white shirt with dark epaulets and a clipped name tag, Torren Vale. His posture was too stiff to be innocent. His lips twitched with forced concern, but his eyes, narrow and unrepentant, betrayed the truth. This wasn't an accident. Silence hung in the air like fog. The few passengers in first class looked up, uncertain whether to react. Their expressions wavered between concern and caution, unsure if what they saw was deliberate or imagined. But one man in a gray suit, seated in 2A, never looked away. His phone had been raised since the jet bridge. Slowly, subtly, he kept filming. Arlen rose without a word, his face composed but stern. His shoulder ached, and Cale shifted lightly against his chest. But the CEO's grip remained steady, every movement controlled. His mind was already racing, dissecting the moment with razor precision. Torren had deliberately tripped him. He was sure of it. The swing of the foot, the whisper, the smugness masked as professionalism. But no one had intervened. Not yet. No one had spoken. His eyes met Torren's, calm yet piercing. "I'm fine," Arlen said softly, to himself more than anyone, as he adjusted Cale's blanket and checked his breathing. The child's chest rose and fell peacefully. Relief flickered in his chest, followed quickly by resolve. Torren took a half-step backward, raising his hands slightly in mock innocence, already posturing for when the questions came. "Didn't see you stop so suddenly. Lot of traffic during boarding. We're on a schedule." Arlen didn't answer. His silence wasn't uncertainty, it was calculation. Years of corporate negotiations had taught him when to speak and when to let others reveal their true face. Right now, Torren was doing exactly that. Behind them, a low murmur rippled from row 3. A passenger leaned into his companion, whispering, "Did he just trip him?" Another responded, "Looked like it," but no one saying anything. Still crouched slightly to support Cale's weight, Arlen took a breath and stepped forward into the cabin. The lighting shifted, warm but clinical. The smell of recycled air, leather seats, polite tension. But behind him, he could still feel Torren's presence like static. From the side, the man in the gray suit finally lowered his phone, eyes flicking to Arlen with an almost imperceptible nod. A quiet solidarity. Arlen had seen it before, people who noticed injustice but were waiting for someone else to move first. He walked slowly down the aisle, not to his seat, but toward the front, toward the captain's cabin. His mind wasn't on comfort anymore, it was on principle, on protection, not just for Cale, but for every silent witness still pretending to scroll their screens. Torren's voice followed again, sharper this time. "Sir, you need to take your seat." Arlen stopped. Without turning, he replied with calm certainty. "Was that an accident back there?" A beat of silence. "I think you're overreacting," Torren said. His voice rose an octave, now loud enough for the cabin to hear. "If you continue to behave erratically, we'll have no choice but to report this as a disturbance." The words were chosen deliberately. Arlen recognized the playbook, coded language designed to flip the narrative. Paint the victim as the problem. Create a paper trail of non-compliance. Remove without consequence. He turned fully now, facing Torin squarely in the aisle. "I'm holding an infant," Arlen said clearly, "and you nearly knocked us both to the floor." Passengers shifted in their seats. A few phones subtly raised. "I don't appreciate being threatened for asking a question," Arlen added, eyes narrowing. Torin's jaw clenched. His grip on the service cart tightened. A faint beeping echoed from near the cockpit. Somewhere behind the scenes, boarding continued, but the air inside the cabin had changed. Tension now pulsed like a second heartbeat. From the back of the cabin, a young flight attendant stood frozen. His name tag read Marvin Rell, barely older than 20. He had watched the entire thing but hadn't moved. Now his fingers twitched at his side, as if his conscience was pulling him toward action. But fear held him still. The man in Tua leaned forward again, this time speaking just loud enough to carry, "I got the whole thing. You weren't imagining it." Arlen glanced his way, nodding once. Behind them, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight crew, please prepare for door closure." But Arlen didn't move. Not an inch. He adjusted Kale again, stepped sideways, and planted his foot in front of the open aircraft door. Passengers blinked in confusion. Torin stepped forward, fury beginning to rise in his voice. "Sir, I'm telling you to sit down or—" Arlen's voice sliced through. Calm, cold, final. "This flight will not leave until the truth is acknowledged." And with that, the moment turned. Every head turned. Every whisper stilled. Torin froze. The door stayed open, and Arlen Merrick stood like a storm about to break. He knew this fall was only the beginning of something far larger. Arlen hit the floor hard, his right shoulder slamming against the cold edge of the aircraft doorway as he twisted mid-fall to protect Kale. The sharp metal frame sent a wave of pain up his arm, but he barely noticed it. His first instinct was his son. Cradled tight to his chest in the soft carrier, Kale let out a muffled squeak, but didn't cry, only stirred, still half asleep. Arlen gritted his teeth and steadied his breathing, lowering his hand to feel the baby's back. A heartbeat, smooth, unharmed breaths. Relief flooded through him, but it was quickly overtaken by something else. Purpose. He rose to his feet slowly, still clutching Kale protectively. His eyes snapped to the man who had done it. Torin Vale stood just inside the aircraft, hands behind his back, expression tight with mock concern. "Watch where you're going," the flight attendant muttered, as if Arlen had simply stumbled over his own feet. Arlen didn't speak for a moment. He stared at Torin, lips parted slightly, waiting to see if the man would acknowledge it. An apology, a flicker of regret, even a twitch of guilt. But none came. Around them, passengers in the first few rows had gone silent. A few leaned into the aisle. One or two sat frozen with hands over their mouths. Arlen turned slightly, still cradling Kale, and asked, not loudly, but with enough control to cut through the stillness, "Did you intentionally try to trip me while I'm holding my child?" Torin's face twitched, barely. Then he scoffed, loud and theatrical, addressing the cabin more than Arlen. "Are you serious right now? You're unstable. Maybe you should sit down before you cause a real problem." His voice dripped with condescension, the kind that tried to flip victim into aggressor. The manipulation was as transparent as the tension in the air. Further back, a young male trainee, barely older than 20, stood half-hidden near the rear galley. Marvin Rell. His eyes were wide, his hands gripping the service wall as if trying not to collapse under the pressure. He had seen everything, Arlen could tell by the frozen conflict on his face. But he said nothing. Torin, sensing hesitation in the room, barked, "Take your seat immediately, sir." He added a false tone of authority, trying to control the scene. "You're holding up the flight." Arlen glanced down the aisle, mentally calculating his position. If he sat, Torin would control the narrative. If he stayed, the confrontation would escalate, but so would the truth. Cale stirred slightly in his carrier, sensing the tension like a tuning fork in his father's chest. Arlen tightened his arms protectively. Every fiber of his being pulsed with clarity. He could not allow this man to set the terms. He stepped calmly into the aisle, facing Torrin head-on. "I'd like to speak to the captain before takeoff." Gasps whispered from behind armrests. Torrin's jaw tensed. "That's not going to happen," he snapped. "You're disrupting the cabin. I'll have you removed if you don't comply." Arlen didn't flinch. Still holding Cale, he took a single, deliberate step backward, toward the aircraft door that hadn't yet been sealed. The move was small, but its meaning thundered. His voice remained steady. "This flight will not leave until the truth is acknowledged." The plane, the crew, the passengers all stilled. Torrin froze in place, realizing something he hadn't considered. Arlen wasn't bluffing. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flailing. He wasn't even threatening. But he was standing between a sealed door and a lie. And he wasn't moving. Arlen knew a storm was forming, and he was ready to stand at its center. Arlen's hand shot out, palm pressed firmly against the inner frame of the aircraft door. The metal was cold beneath his skin, but his grip was steady. The entire plane seemed to freeze in that instant. Passengers who had just begun to look away were now riveted once more, their attention pulled back by the sudden defiance in Arlen's stance. His body blocked the aisle just enough to halt any movement toward the front, but it was his voice, measured, calm, yet unyielding, that captured the moment. "I will not let this aircraft move an inch until my son's safety is respected." Gasps rippled through the cabin like a gust of wind bending tall grass. A few startled passengers looked around, unsure of what to do. A child's toy clattered to the floor somewhere in the middle rows, and Cale whimpered softly in his carrier, disturbed by the rising tension. Arlen gently rocked his body, whispering to his son, "It's all right, little one. Daddy's here." As his eyes stayed locked on the figure approaching him, First Officer Darren Holt. Darren emerged from the cockpit wearing a standard pilot's expression of composed detachment, but his brow furrowed as he scanned the scene. His gaze darted from Torrin, who was visibly tense and slightly flushed, to Arlen, standing still yet resolute, one arm still partially shielding his son. "What seems to be the issue here?" Darren asked, his tone flat, eyes already registering the friction in the room. Before Arlen could speak, Torrin stepped in quickly, grabbing Darren's elbow with forced urgency. "He's refusing to take his seat," Torrin said in a lowered voice, his words sharp with false concern. "He's making a scene, blocking the door. He's putting everyone at risk, including the child." Darren raised an eyebrow. "And why exactly is he doing that?" "He fell," Torrin said quickly. "But now he's exaggerating and accusing me. I tried to help him, but he became combative." Arlen's jaw tightened. The misrepresentation was almost laughable, almost. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the rising hum of tension. "Sir?" came the calm, deliberate tone of Laron Drax, rising from his seat in 2A. He stepped into the aisle slowly, holding up his phone. "You might want to watch the recording before taking any side." The cabin hushed. Torrin froze mid-sentence. His eyes widened slightly, not in surprise that Laron had recorded, but that he had chosen to intervene. Darren looked from Torrin to Laron, then to Arlen. "A recording?" "Yes," Laron said, his tone unwavering. "I saw everything. He tripped Dr. Merrick on purpose. The child could have been seriously hurt." The weight of that accusation changed the air in the cabin. Torrin's authority, once assumed, now teetered on the edge of collapse. He turned slightly, as if to defend himself, but found only the stares of passengers and the blinking red light of a second phone camera in row 5. At the rear, a figure moved. Marvin Rell, the younger attendant, had been watching quietly, hands wringing behind his back. He took a half step forward, eyes flicking toward Arlen. His lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but fear held him still. Arlen noticed. Their eyes met for a second. There was no demand in Arlen's gaze, only a quiet encouragement. But Marvin stayed silent for now. Torin, realizing his narrative was slipping away, tried one last pivot. "You're compromising cabin safety," he snapped, addressing Arlen. "You've refused to comply. That gives us grounds to have you removed." Arlen didn't flinch. "You endangered my child. I'm not going anywhere until this is documented." "We don't take kindly to threats of disruption, sir," Torin said coldly, inching closer. Arlen lifted his free hand slowly, palm open. "I'm not threatening."
"I'm promising accountability."
Darren raised a hand, trying to de-escalate. "Let's all take a breath. No one's going anywhere right now." But the moment had shifted beyond de-escalation. Torin stepped closer, jaw clenched, fists barely restrained at his sides. Arlen adjusted his stance slightly, not aggressive, but firm, protective. Kale stirred again, sensing the weight of the moment. The infant's small fingers curled against his father's chest. Torin's next move was a mistake. "You're trying to hijack this flight with drama," he hissed under his breath. Arlen tilted his head, his voice suddenly lower and sharper.
"No."
"I'm standing in front of an injustice. There's a difference." For a moment, silence filled the aircraft. Passengers barely breathed. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound until the intercom crackled softly in the background. Darren exhaled through his nose, clearly torn between protocol and the reality unraveling in front of him. "All right, no one moves, and no doors close until we sort this." Torin shook his head, stepping back in frustration, but said nothing. And in that stillness, Arlen spoke clearly again, this time with full composure, as if the storm inside him had settled into something immovable. "I will not let this aircraft move an inch until my son's safety is respected." Torin's foot hadn't even fully cleared the aisle when the voices began. "He tripped him," someone muttered from row 2. "He had a baby on him." The tension cracked like glass beneath weight. First Officer Darren Holt turned sharply at the wave of murmurs, his brow furrowing as he stepped out from the cockpit. His voice was calm but edged with command. "What's going on out here?" Torin was on him instantly. "This passenger is refusing to follow boarding protocol," he said, gesturing toward Arlen, who stood silently near the front of the aircraft, still cradling his son Kale close. "He's escalating the situation and holding up departure." Arlen's lips tightened. His shoulder throbbed from the earlier fall, but he showed no sign of distress. Instead, he gently adjusted Kale's carrier and stepped aside to let the murmurs of the cabin rise behind him. Darren looked between the two men. "Passenger, may I ask?" "I'd prefer the captain," Arlen said firmly but evenly. His eyes didn't blink. "This requires a higher decision." The moment paused. A choice hung in the air. Darren hesitated, then turned back toward the cockpit, nodding slowly. "I'll get him." As the door opened again, the atmosphere shifted. Commander Rylan Crest emerged, a tall figure with the posture of someone used to command but not to chaos. His uniform was crisp, his presence steady. His gaze swept the cabin once, and then again, this time slower. "What's happening here?" he asked, not unkindly, but directly. Before anyone else could speak, Torin moved in, voice raised. "The passenger is causing disruption. I advised him to sit, he refused. I believe he's trying to provoke a scene for attention." From behind him, passengers stirred. A man in row 4 leaned forward. A younger boy, maybe 15, gripped his phone, camera still on. Rylan's eyes flicked across them all, then landed on Arlen. "Sir, may I hear your version?" Arlen met his gaze squarely. "I was walking onto the aircraft, carrying my infant son. This crew member," he motioned toward Torin without venom, "intentionally tripped me as I stepped in. I nearly fell forward onto the floor. My shoulder hit the frame instead." Gasps echoed again, softer now but unmistakable. Rylan's expression remained neutral, but the flicker in his eye said something had landed. Torin laughed dryly. "He's exaggerating. It was an accident. And now he's refusing to follow instructions. That's the real issue here." Rylan turned to the cabin. "Did anyone see this happen?" Silence. Then, I did. The voice came from row 2A. Laron Drax rose slowly, holding his phone. And I recorded it. Would you like to see it? Torin went pale, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. Rylan extended a hand. Yes, please. Laron moved down the aisle and handed the device over. Rylan watched the screen in silence. The footage played. Arlen entering, Kale on his chest, the deliberate motion of Torin's foot sweeping behind his ankle. The stumble, the slam, the pause. The captain's jaw flexed as he finished. Behind him, Marvin Rell, still at the galley, looked like a man about to jump out of his own skin. His voice broke the air like a dropped glass. He was complaining about Dr. Merrick before he even got on board, Marvin said softly. Said something about entitled passengers slowing things down. Rylan's head turned slowly toward him. I should have said something earlier, Marvin added, eyes on the floor. Rylan looked back at Torin. Step away from the aisle, he ordered. Torin didn't move. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He's just trying to get special treatment, he hissed. He's exaggerating. That's enough, Rylan snapped, stepping between them. His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. You tripped a man carrying a child. You endangered a life. The cabin froze. No one moved. A flight attendant grabbed the intercom. Security was already being summoned. Torin's face shifted from defiance to disbelief. You can't be serious? This flight isn't leaving with you on board, Rylan said with finality, not even glancing back. And as Torin was escorted down the aisle, protests sputtering into silence, the weight in the cabin shifted, slowly, decisively, back toward truth. Arlen finally felt the weight in the cabin shift, and the truth settling into its rightful place. Arlen Merrick didn't move. Torin Vale had just been removed from the aircraft, but the echo of tension still pulsed through the cabin like residual turbulence. With his infant son Kale in his arms, Arlen remained standing at the front, shoulders squared, eyes calm but alert. The faint ache radiating from his left shoulder was a constant reminder of the deliberate trip that nearly sent his child crashing to the floor. His voice hadn't raised. His hands hadn't clenched. But everything in his stillness declared resistance. Commander Rylan Crest stood just a few feet away, posture professional but slightly tense, as if calculating how to defuse a moment that was no longer within his control. He took a careful step forward and said with tempered softness, Dr. Merrick, please, can we help you to your seat now? Arlen's eyes didn't leave his. Before you seal that door, I need to know something, he replied, tone even but unmistakably firm. He adjusted Kale's weight against his chest. Was this the first report against that crew member this month? The question dropped like a pebble into still water, but the ripples were immediate. A flicker passed over Rylan's face. A flicker too fast for most to see but not for Arlen. The captain blinked once and replied, I can't discuss crew records. His voice was controlled, practiced, but not unshaken. Dramatic irony steeped the moment. Arlen Merrick, once a legal consultant who had helped design federal passenger safety protocols, knew the line that statement walked. He recognized the hesitation in Rylan's eyes, not born of ignorance, but discomfort. The captain wasn't unfamiliar with these rules, but neither was Arlen. Captain, Arlen said, stepping closer but never raising his voice, if there are documented complaints and your airline still placed him in direct service, then you are complicit in enabling a repeat offense, especially if the victim is a passenger with an infant. Rylan didn't respond right away. Around them, the cabin was so silent, the humming of the ventilation system suddenly felt loud. Kale let out a soft murmur in his sleep, and Arlen reflexively adjusted the baby's blanket with quiet care before continuing. I'm not asking for policy theater, he said. I'm asking for accountability before this aircraft seals the cabin and pretends it never happened. Still no reply. So Arlen turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked back toward his assigned seat in the first row. He reached the travel bassinet built into the wall and gently lowered Kale into it, brushing his son's cheek with quiet tenderness. Then he turned to face the entire cabin. His voice was calm, but projected with the clarity of a courtroom closing argument. If anyone here witnessed what happened, if you saw a crew member deliberately trip a passenger carrying a child, I encourage you to remain seated when the crew asks for final compliance. We will not allow silence to erase this. There was no dramatic flourish, no raised fists, just a simple, undeniable appeal to truth. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the man in row 5, an older gentleman in a gray windbreaker, closed his laptop without a word and folded his arms. 2 seats behind him, a teenager who had been nervously holding a phone lifted it higher, recording now with quiet intent. More passengers began murmuring in agreement, their once nervous glances hardening into a shared resolve. Laron Drax, still seated near the front, crossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. His voice, smooth and deliberate, echoed from his row. "We're not going anywhere." Arlen looked at him and nodded. Around the cabin, heads nodded back. And in that moment, a shift occurred, not just in momentum, but in moral clarity. Arlen no longer stood as a solitary voice against a flawed system. He stood with passengers who had seen the line crossed and now, wordlessly, chose to stand with him. And with that, Arlen realized he was no longer standing alone. The cabin door hissed open with a sharp, metallic click, not for takeoff, but for confrontation. A man stepped in with polished shoes that echoed on the jet floor, a black tablet tucked under one arm, his ID badge catching the overhead lights like a warning flare. Braylon Korvax, operations supervisor, carried the subtle air of someone used to having answers rehearsed before questions were even asked. Flanking him was a quiet compliance observer in a navy suit, expression unreadable, hands clasped behind his back like a museum guard waiting for the wrong move. Arlen Merrick remained standing near the front row, Cale now resting in the bassinet seat beside him, bundled and still. The tension in Arlen's shoulders hadn't eased since the fall, and his eyes followed Braylon's every movement, not out of fear, but calculation. "Dr. Merrick?" Braylon began, voice clipped, eyes darting briefly to Cale. "May I have a moment with you in private at the front galley?" "You may," Arlen replied, stepping carefully into the narrow galley space. "But only if this conversation is recorded." He tapped his phone, already running its audio app, and nodded toward the compliance officer. "And witnessed." Braylon hesitated, the practiced ease of his corporate posture cracking for a blink. "Of course," he said tightly. In the slim alcove just behind the cockpit bulkhead, the air felt stiffer. The galley lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow that made the shadows behind Braylon's eyes look deeper. He glanced down at his tablet, then met Arlen's gaze. "We're reviewing the situation," he began cautiously, "and pending our findings, we may need to reassign the flight, perhaps to ensure no further disruption occurs." Arlen's brow furrowed. "You mean remove the man holding the baby," he said slowly, "instead of confronting the culture that enabled this?" Braylon looked away, lips tight. The compliance observer remained still, his eyes unreadable but clearly attentive. A sudden rustle broke the moment. Laron Drax appeared, holding a manila folder in one hand and his phone in the other. He offered the folder to Braylon without a word. Inside was a printed complaint he had filed against Torrin Vale, dated 3 months earlier, marked, "Closed without review." Braylon's eyes skimmed it, and his posture changed. Arlen's voice remained level. "This isn't about one trip. It's about your choice to look away before." Braylon's fingers trembled faintly on the edge of his tablet. The compliance officer leaned slightly forward, catching a glimpse of the blinking status notification on Braylon's screen. Red, flagged, internal review pending. Torrin's name appeared beside 5 past incident tags. "Torrin Vale," Arlen said, enunciating clearly. "Multiple complaints, multiple passengers. And yet you let him continue walking down aisles where children sit unprotected." Braylon tried to steady himself. "Passenger safety is our top priority." Arlen's gaze sharpened. "Then you'll make your internal report, while I prepare mine for the Aviation Safety Council." Silence fell, the kind of silence that burrowed into the air like a drill bit. Braylon stepped back half an inch, tablet dropping to his side, shoulders suddenly weighed down by implications larger than one supervisor's clearance level. He didn't reply, not because he had nothing to say, but because anything he said now could be used in the very report that would likely bear his name. Arlen didn't smile. He didn't move. He simply nodded once, a slow, precise motion, as if placing the final piece on a chessboard he'd been setting for years. And in that silence, Arlen saw what real leverage felt like. The cabin door clicked shut behind Braylon Korvax as he exited, leaving a silence thick with tension and anticipation. Noingenschamd. No safety announcements played. Instead, a collective hush fell over the aircraft as passengers slowly exhaled, glancing toward the front where Dr. Arlen Merrick still stood, calm but unmoving, beside the cockpit door. His infant son Cale, now nestled back in his bassinet, slept peacefully, unaware that the plane meant to carry him home had become a battleground for truth. A man in a plaid blazer leaned over the aisle and whispered to the older gentleman beside him. He really blocked the flight. With a baby. The older man simply nodded. Another passenger further back, early 20s, raised his hand slightly and spoke with conviction that broke the tension. I'll give a witness statement, if he needs it. The words rang clear, echoing forward. I'm licensed in 2 states, added a man in business attire from row 8, his voice firm. I'd be willing to assist any legal effort this man pursues. Arlen didn't react with triumph. He simply acknowledged them with a slow nod, eyes level, mind racing. Inside, he wasn't celebrating solidarity, he was calculating. Every second counted now. Media timelines, legal liability reports, chain of command protocol. His brain shifted into strategist mode, years of corporate negotiation and crisis debriefs funneling into one cold objective. Dismantle the mechanisms that allowed retaliation to thrive. Not just for him, for every parent who might one day walk down this aisle. He sat down quietly, keeping his posture straight as he opened his leather briefcase. From it, he retrieved his tablet and snapped a photograph of the sealed cockpit door, the same one Torrin Vale had walked past minutes before trying to rewrite reality. Arlen tapped his screen, opened his secure legal memo app, and typed a header with deliberate intent. Incident 814, infant endangerment and crew retaliation. The tension hadn't faded. It had simply coiled, like a wire under pressure. He attached the photo, typed a short paragraph documenting the sequence of Torrin's removal, the passengers' responses, and the interim leadership decisions made by Captain Rylan Crest. Every word was neutral, cold, legal, sharp. Then came the next step, one he'd prepared for since the moment his shoulder hit that doorframe. Arlen sent the memo in 2 directions. First, to his legal team at Merrick and Holt LLP. Second, to an investigator named Darren Voss at the Vera Ethics Board, a watchdog agency for federal aviation behavior oversight. Both recipients would receive it within 60 seconds. Across the aisle, Laron Drax watched in silence, subtly angling his phone to capture Arlen's composed focus. His earlier footage of the stumble, the confrontation, the moment Arlen blocked the plane, had already uploaded to a secure cloud archive. And Laron, too, was preparing. Footsteps returned. Commander Rylan Crest stepped back into the cabin, his expression tight but no longer neutral. He moved with the calm of someone trained to handle turbulence, but now forced to navigate moral crosswinds instead of atmospheric ones. He spoke not through the intercom, but directly to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I have a brief update. Crew member Torrin Vale has been placed on suspension pending full review. In addition, the airline's operations board has authorized an immediate audit of our crew rotation and incident response protocols. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes flicked toward Arlen with a rare mix of respect and gravity. A wave of relieved murmurs spread among the passengers. Some nodded. Others clapped softly, not in celebration, but in recognition. For the first time, the weight of accountability didn't feel imaginary. Rylan turned to Arlen. Dr. Merrick, I understand you may still feel uncertain. I've spoken to command. We are prepared to delay this flight further, or reschedule it entirely, if you do not feel safe proceeding. Arlen didn't answer right away. He looked down at Cale, still asleep in the bassinet. Then, slowly, he stood again and faced the captain. "I will reboard," he said. "Only when the position Torin held is replaced. Until then, we are not complete." Rylan nodded once, no resistance offered. "Understood. A new attendant is on standby. They will be on board in 15 minutes. Arlen returned to his seat but didn't relax. His fingers tapped steadily on the tablet as he opened a second document. This one labeled, Flight Ethics Violation, Proposed Reform Notes. Names, dates, prior compliance failures, statistical evidence. He was drafting more than a complaint, he was drawing up a playbook for accountability. Unseen by the rest of the cabin, Braylon Korvax, now in the operations wing of the terminal, stared at his own screen with growing alarm. An alert flashed beside Arlen's name, tagged by the airline's legal systems. Previous advisor, bias training program, declined 2022. Braylon cursed under his breath, realization dawning. The man they'd tried to remove was one of the architects they once ignored. Back on the aircraft, Arlen closed his screen, took a breath, and gently resecured Kale's harness with care. The cabin now buzzed with quiet energy, passengers chatting, heads turning. But no one moved to leave. The front door remained open, just a crack, as the new crew member approached. Rylan stood waiting, and in that quiet moment before transition, Arlen adjusted the carrier strap across his chest and looked once more at the passengers who had watched the entire unraveling. There were no words left to speak. None needed. His email pinged. A reply from Darren Voss. One sentence. "We've seen enough. We're launching the inquiry." Arlen exhaled. Then he reached down and tapped a line into his final memo draft. One that would be time-stamped, backed up, and distributed before the flight ever touched down. And as Arlen strapped his son back in, he realized he hadn't just blocked a flight. He'd exposed a system. Midway through the climb to cruising altitude, with the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of jet engines dulling the room into a soft monotone, Arlen Merrick snapped open his laptop. The seatbelt sign still blinked, but his posture was rigid with purpose. Across the aisle, a few passengers stole discreet glances toward him, the man who had delayed the flight not with outrage, but with unshakable composure. They had seen him hold the aircraft in place with a single sentence and a single arm braced in the doorway. What they didn't know was that Arlen wasn't finished. Not by miles. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before they began their steady rhythm. He wasn't journaling. He was building. First came the subject line, formal complaint and regulatory brief, infant endangerment, crew misconduct, and retaliatory behavior, incident 814. Then, one by one, the details unfolded. Date, flight number, gate location, crew names, policy violations. Attached screenshots from the onboard security feed. Laron Drax's time-stamped footage. A brief note requesting that the full high-definition version be sent to his legal team. Arlen's face remained calm, but his pulse carried the quiet intensity of someone who had moved from defense to offensive coordination. He copied in multiple addresses, the FAA's Passenger Rights Division, the National Aviation Ethics Council, and two key journalists, one from the independent watchdog platform Flightlight and the other from a civil liberties column that had covered his previous advocacy work. Row 4B was silent, but within Arlen's mind, there was a storm of calculations, legal paths, public statements, back-channel communications, timeline documentation. His primary objective had transformed. This was no longer about rectifying a single flight's injustice. It was about striking at the structure that enabled it. Meanwhile, across the city, Braylon Korvax's phone buzzed on his desk with a second corporate legal alert. He hadn't yet unpacked from his hasty return to operations headquarters, but the voice on the other end of the line wasted no time. "Braylon, we need context now. Who exactly is Dr. Merrick? And why is our inbox full of federal queries?" Braylon's throat dried instantly. He toggled his screen and searched Arlen's name again. His eyes widened when he saw it. Arlen Merrick, principal consultant, founder of Ascend Ethics Advisory. The same name that appeared 2 years ago on an internal report recommending urgent upgrades to bias training protocols for cabin crew. Recommendations that had been marked non-priority and shelved after an executive meeting. Now, those same choices glared back with the sharpness of consequence. Back on the flight, Arlen inserted the final statement. His screen displayed it in clean, bold font before he hit send. He tripped a father holding a child. That should have grounded more than a plane, it should ground your culture. His eyes lingered on it, not for validation, but for clarity, for precision. He tapped send, leaned back, and gently checked on Kale, now sleeping again under a soft blanket. Outside the window, stars blinked over a cloud line. Below them, corporate servers would begin to stir. Legal inboxes would ping. Flight ethics officers would be summoned into early meetings. Complaint archives involving black passengers and infants, previously marked low priority, would be pulled into urgent review. And 38,000 feet above the same runway where he had been tripped, Arlen Merrick launched the first wave of accountability. He smirked, confident the act would go unnoticed, unaware that every passenger, every protocol, and every obstacle was about to be challenged head-on. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when courage and strategy unite, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The room fell into a silence so sharp it could cut glass. A panel of 4 tribunal officials sat upright behind a crescent-shaped desk, each draped in dark navy coats that bore the emblem of the Oran Federal Aviation Tribunal.
No introductions. No pleasantries.
Just the faint hum of recessed lighting and the slow, rhythmic click of a ceiling-mounted camera adjusting its lens. Dr. Arlen Merrick stood at the center, flanked by 2 projection screens and a slim microphone in front of him. The moment had arrived not to revisit the fall, but to put the entire system on trial. Arlen tapped the center button on the tablet in front of him. "Please direct your attention to the left screen," he said, his voice even, resolute. The video played silently at first, grainy footage from Laron Drax's phone showing Torin's foot sweeping behind Arlen's as he stepped onto the aircraft. The room watched as Arlen twisted mid-fall, cradling Kale in his arms, hitting the metal threshold with bone-jarring force. A gasp escaped from one of the aides seated along the wall. Arlen didn't react. He let the video play again, this time with audio. "You need to watch where you're going," Torin's voice sneered, faint but audible. As the clip ended, one of the tribunal officers, a square-jawed man with silver at his temples, leaned forward. "Dr. Merrick, for the record, how many seconds elapsed between that fall and the first attempt at accountability?" Arlen looked him in the eye. "0. I stood up and asked the man if he had done it intentionally. And the airline's initial response? They tried to remove me from the plane. Not him." He didn't need to raise his voice. The precision in his tone carried the weight of something deeper, something practiced, lived, earned. From across the table, the airline's lead counsel, Mr. Retton Varn, shifted uncomfortably. "We fully cooperated with the investigation," he began, his fingers twitching beside a legal pad. Arlen raised a second tablet. "Then explain this." He tapped once, and the screen behind him lit up with a forwarded internal email, timestamped 1 hour after the incident. From Braylon Korvax TO, Ops Control HQ Subject, Passenger Blockade, Containment Strategy. Consider reassigning the passenger to avoid further escalation. He appears to be gaining traction with others. We should get the aircraft moving before footage leaks. Gasps rippled again, this time from the public gallery. The words were damning. Not just evasion, but active strategy to suppress. Dramatic irony filled the space. The airline claimed cooperation, but their own internal memo spoke otherwise. Arlen's voice was steady. This wasn't just mishandling. It was containment by culture. He turned again to the tribunal, clicking through annotated stills from the footage. Frame by frame, he highlighted not just the fall, but the expressions of the passengers. The way some flinched, the frozen fear on Marvin Rell's face, the deliberate posture of Torin as he leaned in with performative authority. "This is not about a single act of misconduct," Arlen continued. "It's about the institutional instinct to deny, deflect, and delay, especially when the victim is a black father with a child in his arms." A pause. "Permission to call the next witness?" asked the tribunal's lead official. A door opened near the sidewall. Marvin Rell stepped in, suit slightly wrinkled, face pale but determined. He approached the center with the gait of a man carrying something heavier than truth: regret. He cleared his throat and adjusted the mic. "I stayed silent too long," he said quietly. "I saw the whole thing. I knew it wasn't an accident. And when Mr. Merrick stood in that aisle and refused to let the plane take off, I thought he was causing trouble. But he wasn't. He was protecting his kid. He was right to block that plane." The words landed like a verdict before the verdict. One of the tribunal officers looked down at a thick folder of FAA notes and muttered under his breath. 3 other reports in the last 2 years. None acted on. Arlen didn't flinch. He'd read those same notes days ago. He knew the patterns. Knew how many closed with no action stamps had been applied to passengers who didn't have a platform or a recording. This was never just about him. It was about the father who couldn't file a report because his child had no words yet. It was about the system that waited until someone blocked a plane to admit it needed fixing. He leaned into the mic one last time. "If I hadn't stood there, holding my child, someone else's would have suffered next." And with that, the tribunal's gaze turned, not to him, but to the system that let it happen. The tribunal ruling came swiftly, but the weight of it echoed like a slow drum roll across the hall. Based on the visual evidence, recorded testimonies, and airline protocol violations, the lead adjudicator announced, "This panel rules in favor of Dr. Arlen Merrick. The environment on board Flight 814 was determined to be unsafe for an infant passenger due to obstructive crew conduct and retaliatory behavior, constituting a hazardous environment unfit for flight." The sentence struck like a gavel against marble. Arlen sat silently at the witness table, Cale's photo folded into the lining of his wallet, hidden but ever present. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. His eyes remained focused, calm, calculating. This ruling was only the first doorway. The one that came next required something more than judgment. It demanded vision. As reporters rushed to publish headlines and camera shutters clicked in chaotic staccato, Arlen leaned toward his attorney, a gray-bearded strategist named Vernon Case. "File it," Arlen said quietly. Vernon nodded once, stood, and turned toward the clerk's desk at the edge of the room. Within minutes, a second filing had been submitted. A parallel civil suit, not seeking damages, not seeking apologies. It demanded something far rarer: the creation of a federal infant passenger safety compliance board. The filing itself sent ripples across the aviation world. Industry analysts raised eyebrows. Executives panicked behind boardroom glass. The airline's legal team, seated just 2 rows away, visibly stiffened. One even muttered, "He's going for legislation?" Yes, he was. Arlen stepped to the press stand outside, addressing the crowd with deliberate clarity. "This isn't about one fall. It's about the standard we accept for those who cannot speak, stand, or protect themselves at 30,000 feet. If the cabin crew had followed protocol, my son would not have been placed in harm's way. If the airline had acted on past warnings, that crew member wouldn't have been in uniform." The media storm ignited within hours. Hashtags spread. Hashtag Cale compliance. Hashtag Flight 814 reform. News segments replayed the cabin footage in slow motion. Torrens' foot, the stumble, Arlen's hand bracing against the doorway, Cale's fragile form cradled in protection. But something else happened that no executive had predicted. The letters. Dozens. Then hundreds. Families from across the country began submitting their own testimonies. Mothers, fathers, guardians, each detailing similar mistreatment, overlooked incidents, or silent bias during domestic and international travel. One man described being denied pre-boarding despite carrying twins. Another wrote of his autistic son being berated for making noise. One letter read simply, "We thought we were alone until we saw what Dr. Merrick did." Back at the airline's headquarters, panic took shape. Public relations teams worked overtime. A proposal for a generous financial settlement was drafted and forwarded to Arlen's firm within 72 hours. But Vernon returned it without comment, except one line scribbled at the bottom: "Structural reform, nothing less." The airline's executive board convened an emergency ethics panel. In the closed-door meeting, Braylon Korvacs was quietly asked to step down in the interest of public trust. The move was meant to signal accountability, but Arlen knew better. He wasn't interested in scapegoats. He was aiming for an ecosystem overhaul. Meanwhile, the firm's research division uncovered something that had been buried deep in airline archives. A personnel pattern so alarming it reignited the fire. A whistleblower stepped forward, an internal compliance analyst named Colin Maris, who had reviewed incident logs related to crew conduct. With trembling hands and a whistleblower protection document signed, he handed over a flash drive. Inside, 5 separate passenger altercations involving Torrin Vale. 2 involved infants. None were formally escalated. All had been labeled resolved on board. When Vernon showed Arlen the files, Arlen leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, and exhaled. They let him stay in rotation, he murmured, with babies on board. Colin confirmed with a nod, shame heavy in his voice. There was pressure not to escalate. They said he was just direct, not dangerous. I should have spoken out sooner. Arlen didn't respond with anger, just resolve. You're speaking now. By week's end, the tribunal's ruling had morphed from a singular judgment into the foundation of a broader reckoning. Legal scholars began citing the case as a potential precedent in passenger rights law. Senators reached out requesting briefings. The Federal Transit Oversight Committee requested copies of the footage and the tribunal's decision. The cracks had widened into corridors, and the corridors were beginning to fill with people who'd waited too long in silence. Arlen stood one evening at the window of his office, looking out over the lit skyline, Cale asleep in the crib behind him. On the desk sat the printed whistleblower report, half covered by the first draft of a federal policy blueprint bearing a bold title, the Infant Passenger Safety Compliance Proposal. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need revenge. He needed change.
Permanent, intouchable change.
As he turned out the light and lifted his son, he whispered, not just for you, for every child who travels after you. And suddenly, it wasn't about one fall. It was about a pattern that had already bruised too many in silence. The room was already full when Arlen Merrick stepped onto the stage of the National Travel Safety Symposium. Rows of suited officials, aviation veterans, young fathers with strollers parked at their sides, and reporters with camera drones hovering silently above. All eyes turned to the man whose quiet resistance had grounded more than a plane. A hush spread as he adjusted the lapel mic clipped to his blazer. There were no formal introductions. He didn't need them anymore. We don't need perfection in air travel. Arlen began without preamble, his voice calm, steady. We need protection, especially for those who cannot defend themselves. A screen behind him lit up with a still frame of the cabin door, just as he had once blocked it with one hand while cradling Cale in the other. The image hung like a monument in the room, drawing nods from many, tension from a few. Arlen's presence filled the space not with fire, but with gravity. He wasn't there to stir anger. He was there to define direction. He paced once across the stage, glancing toward a group of legislators seated in the front row. The real issue, he continued, is not whether a single flight attendant failed his duty, but whether the systems above him allowed it to happen again and again. His voice held weight but never malice. That flight wasn't delayed by chaos. It was delayed by conscience. As murmurs filled the room, the moderator, an older logistics executive, stepped up and placed a folder on the podium. Inside, the finalized bipartisan resolution announcing the formation of the Infant Passenger Safety Compliance Board. A standing ovation erupted before Arlen even touched it. Reporters jotted down notes furiously. Cale, now healthy and laughing in the arms of Arlen's brother in the front row, let out a soft giggle that carried through the mic. The sound lightened the tension in the room, grounding it in the innocence they were all gathered to protect. At the official signing ceremony an hour later, Arlen didn't pose. He didn't speak further. He simply stepped forward, lifted Cale into his arms, and handed the printed cabin incident report, bound in a navy blue cover, to the new board chair, a stern but sympathetic ethics official named Garrett Vaughn. "This isn't a complaint," Arlen said quietly to him, their exchange just audible to the surrounding press. "It's a blueprint. Let it never be filed away." Meanwhile, quiet shifts rippled across the aviation landscape. The airline that once dismissed the footage of the trip now featured Arlen's quote, verbatim, in the opening pages of its in-flight safety manual. The words, "A child's safety must never depend on silence," were now company policy. The irony was not lost on those who had once stood against him. In a separate press notice, Marvin Rell, the once-shaken trainee who had hesitated at the moment of truth, was announced as the first junior attendant appointed to the ethics training redesign team. His name, once buried beneath fear, now stood as a symbol of learning, of growth, of courage found late but not too late. Braylon Korvacs, who had once tried to quietly reassign Arlen mid-incident, submitted his resignation just days before the symposium. No statement, no protest, just absence. And Torrin Vale, the man who had tripped Arlen with Kale in his arms, issued a single-line public apology, an apology too late to matter, too empty to restore trust. The Federal Aviation Ethics Council announced his permanent bar from service that same week. And then came the plaque. Late in the evening, under a soft amber sky at the Verith terminal, for operations officers bolted a small, brushed steel plate just outside Gate 6. It bore no brand name, no names at all, just 4 words etched cleanly into the metal, its surface catching the reflection of passing travelers. This plane waited rightfully. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Dr. Arlen Merrick stepped out into the main corridor of the newly renovated Verith terminal. Fluorescent lighting had been replaced by a warm amber glow, casting gentle halos on the polished flooring. But Arlen didn't notice the design. His eyes went straight to the sign above Gate 6, subtle, elegant, and impossible to ignore, Priority Infant Safety Access Zone. The words weren't just decoration. They were born of conflict, written into policy by resolve, and mounted in a place where silence had once allowed harm to walk freely. Kale, now 18 months old and toddling with fierce independence, clutched his father's finger tightly as they crossed the terminal floor. Every step carried memory. This was where it had happened. The trip, the fall, the lie, the resistance. But today was different. Today was reclamation. A quiet hum of conversation filled the space, but as Arlen passed a row of check-in counters, several uniformed staffers fell silent. One young security officer stood up a little straighter. Another gently nudged his partner, whispering, "That's him." But no one obstructed Arlen's path. No one hurried him along. No one asked for identification. The weight of his previous stand was everywhere, etched into posture, policy, and the air itself. Beside him walked Marvin Rell, no longer the trembling trainee from that day, but a junior supervisor now dressed in a navy blue blazer and polished shoes. His gait was more confident, though every so often, his eyes flicked toward Arlen with quiet reverence. "I still think about it," Marvin said softly as they neared Gate 6. Arlen glanced sideways. "The day it happened?" "No," Marvin replied, shaking his head. "The moment you blocked the door. The way everyone looked at you. I didn't know a person could hold that much weight just by standing still." Arlen didn't answer right away. They arrived at the gate's waiting area where the tile floor transitioned into soft carpet. Parents lounged with infants in strollers, some feeding bottles, others adjusting carriers. The overhead announcements were now prefaced with a line that hadn't existed before. "Families traveling with infants may board at any time for safety and comfort." As if on cue, a nervous-looking father stood near the boarding lane, fumbling with the strap of his baby's harness. He seemed frustrated, unsure how to secure the carrier to the seat in front of him. A uniformed staffer stepped forward, not rushed, not indifferent, but calm, steady. "Sir, may I help?" the attendant asked, kneeling beside him with trained precision. Arlen paused mid-step. He observed the exchange closely, reading not just action but intent. The staffer checked the strap placement, adjusted the safety clip, and reassured the father with a warm, "You're all set. You're doing great." That, Arlen knew, hadn't been part of any old manual. That was new. And it mattered. Dramatic irony stirred like an invisible breeze. 6 months ago, that same space was a crucible of negligence. Today, it was a classroom of accountability. He let Kale guide him forward, the boys' tiny shoes tapping rhythmically as they approached the familiar wall beside Gate 6. Above them, a sleek, high-resolution display looped a short message. White text floated against a charcoal backdrop. All children aboard our aircraft deserve safety, dignity, and protection at all times. The voice narrating it was steady, calm, and instantly recognizable. Every seatbelt fastened, every crew member trained, every decision made must remember the smallest voice on board. Because dignity doesn't come with age. It begins with arrival. Passengers paused to listen. A woman gently nudged her teen son to remove his earbuds. An older man clutched the armrest of his wheelchair a little tighter. Several young fathers standing with diaper bags slung over their shoulders exchanged glances, grateful, maybe even surprised that someone had spoken for them. The screen cut briefly to a still image, Arlen holding Kale, standing before a cabin door, his arm outstretched as if forbidding injustice from passing. Then it faded back into the loop. Marvin cleared his throat, voice quieter now. They made me watch it again during the supervisor seminar. That footage. They said it's part of ethics certification now. Arlen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good. They stopped at the viewing pane, the same pane Arlen had stared through when the flight was delayed. The same one where resolution had replaced resignation. Kale stepped forward on unsteady legs and placed his hand against the glass. His palm left a tiny smudge as a plane taxied slowly across the runway in the distance, lights blinking against the dusk. Arlen knelt beside him, one hand bracing the child's back, the other resting against the floor. He looked not just at the runway but through time, through the memory of being tripped, humiliated, doubted, and told to sit quietly for the sake of process. He leaned closer and whispered to his son, voice low but firm. This is where it happened, but it's not where it ends. Because the day they tried to trip him was the day he taught the system how to walk straight. The conference hall was silent, not from absence of sound, but from the gravity of what had just been said. Arlen Merrick stood at center stage beneath a paneled skylight that washed the room in calm daylight. The placard beside him read International Ethics in Transit Conference, but all eyes were fixed on him, not the title, not the hall. Just him. 1 year ago today, Arlen began, his voice steady but charged with something deeper. My infant son was nearly harmed by an act so small, it almost went unpunished. He let the sentence hang. The tension didn't need drama. It had truth. He wasn't behind a podium. He had insisted they remove it. If I'm going to speak about systems that hide behind barriers, he'd told the organizers, then I won't be standing behind one. He held nothing but a wireless mic and the quiet resolve of a man who had earned every inch of justice through resistance. A ripple of unease passed through the audience, aviation executives, ethics boards, government observers. Arlen's words were scalpel-sharp, not angry, not performative, just exact. What began as a trip ended in something far more lasting. Because when someone trips a father holding a child, they don't just bruise the man. They bruised the structure that let it happen. From the back row, a man in a dark blazer, the same Braylon Korvacs who had once tried to reassign Arlen off a flight to avoid accountability, shifted in his seat. He didn't think Arlen had noticed him. He was wrong. I was told by many to move on, to let it go, that mistakes happen on aircraft, that maybe it wasn't intentional. But what happens when those mistakes always happen to the same kind of passenger? Or to the ones too small to speak for themselves? He paced slowly across the stage, pausing beside the projection screen. Let me show you something. The lights dimmed slightly, and on the wide display behind him, an image appeared, grainy but unmistakable. A black and white still of Arlen standing at the aircraft doorway, one hand braced against the inner frame, the other holding Kale to his chest. Torrin Vale stood in the background, frozen mid-motion, expression tense. This was the moment I stopped the plane, Arlen said quietly. Not to delay others. not to draw attention, but because if that door had closed, so would the truth. Gasps fluttered around the hall, but Arlen continued before they could settle. What you may not know is what came after. The tribunals, the footage, the wave of stories from other parents who'd stayed silent. He paused, then turned toward the audience with a flicker of something deeper. Hope, perhaps. I never told anyone what happened with the settlement funds. I didn't need applause for doing what should be expected of anyone in my position. But today, on the 1-year mark, you deserve to know. He tapped a small remote. Another image replaced the first, this time, the logo of a newly launched nonprofit, the Kale Merrick Passenger Integrity Trust. The name alone sent murmurs through the crowd. It exists to provide legal aid to mistreated travelers with infants, Arlen said. And it's already helped over 130 parents file reports that were once buried. One of those cases stopped a retaliatory crew action last month, in a country halfway around the world. From the front row, a gray-haired executive wiped his glasses. Others scribbled notes, not because they had to, but because something irreversible had just occurred. This isn't about punishment. It's about prevention, Arlen continued, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. About making sure that when someone sees a child in danger, they don't check a policy manual before acting, they check their conscience. He closed the remote and let it fall to his side. We are building airports designed for efficiency. But justice, he said slowly, takes time. The crowd erupted, not in noise, but in stillness. A stillness louder than applause. The kind that carries weight. That says, we heard you. We'll remember this. At the edge of the stage, movement stirred. A small figure broke free from the arms of a seated man and ran forward with clumsy determination. It was Kale, wobbling in tiny shoes, now walking on his own. He rushed up the steps with a giggle, tugged at Arlen's sleeve, and raised his arms with complete trust. Arlen looked down, eyes softening instantly, and picked up his son. Together, they turned toward the exit. Behind them, the screen changed one final time. A new still appeared, black and white, hauntingly iconic. Arlen at the aircraft door, Kale wrapped to his chest. The pose unplanned, but now permanent. Below it, bold white text faded in. One step back saved thousands forward. And with that, the father who once blocked a plane walked forward into history, with his son leading the way. He forced the CEO down, and froze as the father stood tall, blocking takeoff and asserting command over the entire aircraft. If you believe real authority acts decisively to protect the innocent, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger and family.